what's getting more better is people are realizing what can and cannot be done with a book. So if your goal is just to sell a bunch of books, that's actually super hard to do. It's hard to do when you're competing against a couple million other books, plus the streaming platforms, all the other entertainment that's out there. But when you understand what you can do with a book, which is you can get more visible, you can use it as a marketing tool, you can use it to get credibility, to tie into things like media, to speaking, to promoting a consulting business and so on, then you can focus on that and actually set more achievable versions of goals.
Step into the world of success with Your Brand Amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Anika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success. When you quit your job, do you have a financial runway, savings for 6 months, a spouse's income to fall back on? Tim Lindsay quit with negative net worth at $0, sometimes less. And instead of panicking, he bootstrapped a self-publishing company that's now pulled over 6,000 books in 11 years. This isn't a story about lucky timing. It's not a story about a silver bullet business idea. It's about building repeatable systems, making hard decisions about people and priorities, and also getting back up when your business nearly collapses. In Tim's case, during a 128-day NICU crisis with his newborn. Tim Lindsay today is founder and CEO of Tellwell Publishing, and he's joining us to talk about what it really takes to scale from nothing, how to position a book as a tool for authority and visibility, and the publishing landscape as it exists today, which, spoiler alert, looks very different than it did when he started. Tim, I am so thrilled to welcome you to Your Brand Amplified.
Thanks for having me here, Anika. I'm excited to see where the conversation goes.
Me too. And I really love the beginning of your origin story, right, for the publishing arm, because I've walked away from really well-paying jobs with no savings, no 6 months, no backup plan, not really knowing what I was necessarily going to do next. I don't know that a lot of people do that, have the fortitude to say, I need to be doing something different. So take us back to that moment. Talk about what that was like. What prompted you to make a shift?
Okay, so you're talking about the moment when I quit my day job and went into business, and you're saying I had like zero or negative zero net worth, but you make it sound bad. For me, this was like the highlight because at the time I had 50,000 of credit card debts, after school, and I was slowly there's a sort of a moment where I was actually before launching the business, there was a moment where I actually went and I was curious about credit counseling. I'm like, because my credit cards were close to max because I had been struggling with self-employment. So I had managed the campus newspaper for a couple of years, and that led up to 2008, 2009, the financial crisis. And so that's when I was originally sort of forced into self-employment and had to go at it. And that didn't turn out into anything, but that was still, that was a struggle I experienced working from home, trying to do sales from home, trying to develop my skills. And so fast forward several years to that moment, I was actually getting to zero net worth, but I had been chipping away for 2 years to get rid of all my debts. I was actually more responsible. I was more prudent in my mind. So when I quit my day job as I was reaching zero, I thought I was soaring high, getting above air from instead of having all this debt. So I did do it somewhat prudently though. So I quit my day job. I had worked in this world of self-publishing and publishing, so I knew it really well, and I had built some skills that were fundamental. I had learned sales. I was someone like many people who grew up not liking the idea of sales and marketing. It's like, oh, these are icky things. And I had all those attitudes. I was very against sales, the idea of selling. And so when I was ready to leave that day job, I did it. I had been doing a bit of a side hustle for a few months, and I had planned to be more calculating about when I would leave, but I had the intuitive sense I was starting to get clients, and then I was starting to get busy. And when you have a full-time job, that's quite a few hours. And I was doing another 100 plus. I know I was tracking it very closely. I had an app where I would track exactly how many minutes and hours I spent on marketing, on sales, on service development, and then on delivering service. So I had started to, I threw up a website, I threw up some advertising. I started all of a sudden getting those inbound inquiries, started to talk to authors, and I knew that world really well. And it's a funny thing when you start a business, it's so hard, but you have imposter syndrome. But I actually, what's the movie with the sports agent, Tom Cruise,
Oh, yeah.
who's representing the underdog character? I actually had an author who referred to me that way, and it's surprising how people will actually really be interested in working with a small company where it's very personal, as long as you know what you're doing. And so I had people who would come to my little apartment and just to meet me, and boom, they were very happy to work with me and they were very happy with the service. But yeah, that's a big leap going from where you decide, you know what, you're starting to generate revenue, but to just give up your day job, boom, that income every 2 weeks, twice a month, the cash that's going into your bank, that's just not going to show up anymore. And you're sort of saying, well, my time is actually more valuable, but we like to say our time is more valuable, but is it actually going to bring in the dollars? So yeah, so that was a tough little leap, but it was worth it. And there was definitely a prehistory leading up to that where I had slaved away, failed at self-employment, taken a day job where I wasn't making much money, but you can learn a lot in an industry through working a day job. If you look at it that way, instead of paying for schooling, you're working a job, but you're learning an industry, you're building skills. And I certainly saw it that way.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate the way that you're framing it because, of course, I was being a little dramatic, but it is often the case. There are people who leave mid career who've maybe built up some equity and then they finally find that pivot. And then there are people who just can't take it anymore and say, I need to really go all in on myself. And so that failure, as you called it, isn't really a failure from your first time being an entrepreneur, owning your own business. It's really lessons that you're able to take into the now and into what you did eventually become really successful at.
And not having so much to lose as well, right? As life goes on, you start to worry more about security, you have more responsibilities, you have family and so on. But, when you're a little bit earlier in your life, you may have nothing, but you also have less to lose, right? So had that going in my favor.
Yeah. And, I think it's such an interesting moment to pick self-publishing and to dive in. You said that you had some experience in this, but you knew you could do something a little bit differently. What was it that you saw that was missing from the market?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how much you know about the market, but there was the traditional model of publishing where you try to get a publisher to invest in your book.
Yeah.
And that was the way it was done for years and years. And for a long time, there was a stigma that was put on self-publishing. It was called vanity publishing and it was stigmatized. And there was a lot of downsides to doing it. And the people or the companies who tried doing it, it didn't work very well because in those days, you had to do a big print run. You have all these books, they're in your basement and your garage and your car. You have no access to bookstores, you have no access to the sales channels. And the traditional route, you had to get an agent, then to get a publisher, and then they have to try to get you into bookstores. So there's a lot of gatekeepers to get to a final reader. So what happened was in the mid 1990s, the internet happened. More specifically, Amazon.com was launched in 1995. And at the same time that happened, print on demand had happened. So you could print one book. So the combination of the internet plus print on demand meant that a lot of the barriers to selling your book to distribution had vanished. Add to that ebooks not too long after, and then audiobooks, the industry had changed. But still, the industry, the way it worked is like you had a choice. You could try to go self publishing, but if you wanted help with self publishing, the businesses that were established just hadn't set it up in a way that you got the advantages of self-publishing, which are many. So the advantages of self-publishing are you can decide. You're in control of the decision to publish. You're in control of the timeline. You're in creative control. You control the pricing of your book, and your royalties are 5 to 10 times higher. So there's a lot of advantages to self-publishing, and in this new industry, the downsides of traditional publishing were more evident. It's a long sales effort to try to get an agent, to try to get a publisher, and the rejection rate is really high. And it's rejection not because your book has no value or you don't have something worthy, but it's just kind of the business reality. So I spoke to a few publishers. They say 3 times a year they open up for submissions. They get about 500 submissions and they publish about 5 each quarter. This is a smaller publisher, but it's the same thing at a larger scale. So imagine you had to pick 1 out of 100 manuscripts. It's not necessarily the best manuscript, and it's not to say the other 99 don't have value, but you're going to try to pick people who maybe have a platform of some sort,
Yeah.
somebody who you've almost got guaranteed sales, right? Because the author knows how to market themselves, they have a platform. So that's how that model works. So when I was coming into the space, though, I realized so more and more people wanted to go the self-publishing route, but they didn't want to do it all themselves. And the current state of the industry was that if they tried to get help from a business, they would be giving up a lot of the benefits of self-publishing, the flexibility, the ultimate control, the creative control, having access to keep all your royalties and so on. So what I realized was people just they wanted to publish. They're motivated by a bunch of things besides just the bottom line. So people often get confused, like, is it worth publishing? Should I publish? And they may have a very narrow sense of like what a traditional publisher is thinking, which is, can I make a profit from this
Right.
book? But when it comes to why everyday people consider publishing, or entrepreneurs or coaches, they're thinking about why they're publishing is broader, and it's more about humanity. And we could get into it, but it's a mix of sort of what they can do with a book as an act of service, what they can do with a book as an act of strategy or authority for business, or for as a tool to build something. And then there's this third stream of motivation in publishing, which is more about the journey itself, the learning, the expression, the connection, the pursuing a passion. And so those are three very different lines of why people publish books that are a very different way of looking at it than just a bottom line approach to whether or not a book should be published.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Particularly, I've heard in the traditional publishing world that even if you get a book published, sometimes they're not going to market it as much, depending again on who you are, what kind of name you have. I've heard things about getting on these bestseller lists for the New York Times, and the credentials and the things may not mean that you are actually a bestseller at that moment. There could be this entirely other criteria that those things are being based on. So I'd love to hear a little bit more, dig into the three things that you're talking about, what the motivations behind writing a book that are, yes, we want to make money, but there are also a lot of other great things about writing. And where is your sweet spot?
Well, I think it's important for the author to understand their own motivations and their own goals so that we can assess if we can help with that. For an example, maybe a story can illustrate it. One of our authors was from South Sudan, and he was 10 years old, living like a rural area, like farming, very poor. And there's a bunch of meetings in his village. And then basically some people came up to his door, and they were from the People's Liberation Army. Got to put a good name on a nasty civil war situation. And they were basically, his parents had a choice of which of their children, of their boys, to pass over to become a child soldier. And so he that was 10 years old. That's why his book is called The 10-Year-Old Man. He had to grow up very fast. And for 10 years, he was in that situation, very harsh, using burlap sacks for shelter and, working, just being a child in that sort of environment. But he survived for 10 years and escaped to Kenya, where there was a refugee camp, and had a little bit of hope. Finally, 10 years later, escapes to a refugee camp. There's 800,000 people there, I believe. And 1 year turns to 2 years, turns to 3 years, turns to four. Finally, he's on an airplane going to Australia. He lands in Australia. He says he cries the first day he gets there, just wondering, why did people he doesn't even know decide to help him? And he had this dream at the time of having a cell phone, having a roof over his head, and there he is in Australia. And so moving on from that, he starts writing his book. He integrates into society. And when he's writing at first, he's just, it's like catharsis. He's trying to make sense of this crazy life he's had. But as he writes, it starts turning into this story, and he realizes, okay, this isn't just about him. There's some themes in here about being a refugee, about resilience. And so he starts to think not just about himself anymore, about writing for the healing. And there's actually some interesting work on what writing can do to help heal and help you make sense of your life and so on. People write for those reasons. But then he starts writing, he realizes there's these themes that have broader significance to public policy, to helping people overcome very challenging life experiences. And then, of course, what are you going to do? He finishes the book, he gets it professionally done, he works with an editor, and then, well, what are you going to do with that? He starts to transition to do public speaking, to speaking at major conferences, and you can see him in a suit and a tie, and he's talking about these important themes. And now he starts to become a professional speaker, and this is part of his career or entrepreneurial path. He did build a career in health and safety in the mining industry in Australia and built a family. It's an amazing story. But so his book, it started out in this sort of catharsis, healing sort of writing. Then it starts to be, okay, wait, this is actually a book with a real audience, and it can serve, it can be of value to someone. That's the service why. And then the last piece is, wait, using the book as a tool to further sort of a strategy as in his entrepreneurial, in his career, becoming a public speaker, becoming an advocate, those sorts of things. So those are the three broad motivations. I use three words: give, build, become. The
Mm.
service why is give. What are you doing of value to your reader or to society? Build is about using a book as a tool. Doesn't necessarily, I don't like the word selfish. It's like, what are you doing with the book for yourself? Because, building a business is also an act of service. It can also have benefits to yourself, but, it's hard to know someone's deepest, who's to judge what's the true motivator. Most businesses I find are really rooted in service, but then, we all struggle with being a good person. And then that third piece though is the journey. And I like to compare the journey. So it's like, well, is a book worth doing if it's just for the journey of it? Is that a good enough reason? But you can unpack that. It's like for expression. I like to compare it to how else you could use your time. So a lot of people spend time consuming media, getting
Right.
angry, getting polarized, being separated. And so a book, even if it is a passion project or a side project, it can be a better use of time and money if you're investing in things like editing than the alternative, right? Even if you have a day job and this is your side passion project where you're providing entertaining storytelling, or you're doing local history, or you're exploring a topic that's important to you, that can be a more meaningful use of your time than a lot of ways we can waste time. So to me, that journey why is not something that to just be dismissed. And yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point, and one that people probably don't think enough about because obviously I'm in the world of business. I know a lot of people who write a book or who want to write a book who are they have either an entrepreneur or they're a founder or they became a really big C-suite level person at some big company. But I also know somebody who doesn't even have a LinkedIn, doesn't really do a lot on social, and is writing a book right now because she wants to get the story out. And she already has a second book in mind, right? And so that's kind of some of the things that you're talking about because she's really writing it for herself and for other people who might be have families with mental health issues and some of the things that her family struggled with that she had to deal with as a child and as an adult. But that's a story, even though she's writing initially for herself, it is a story, just like the example that you just gave of she can do so much more with this afterwards because it will help people.
Well, that gets to the decision of whether you're going to publish it or just write it. Because you can write a diary, you can write a journal, you can get all sorts of benefits from writing. But then when you start to get to, okay, am I going to publish it? Then you should probably start to be thinking about it's not just about your own journey, your own experience. Once you decide it's worth publishing, presumably that's because you think it could be of significance to someone else. And that someone else doesn't have to be a vast audience. It could be if you're not doing it for money per se, but you would like to make an impact, it could be the impact on one person's life. Like we've had, well, one of the first authors I worked with, I remember when I was still at home on the balcony and still had a day job, I think, was writing a book about a mother duck losing her feathers. And he was writing this book because his wife was going through breast cancer treatment
Mm.
and they had two little girls or two little children that they had to try to explain what was happening as she's losing her hair. So his main audience maybe is those two children, but then he's also thinking, well, what about other children who have parents who are going through cancer treatments?
Wow.
And so, then you're thinking, okay, it's for my children, but maybe there's another niche audience out there. And so that's the motivation. So what's the impact though? Is it going to make a lot of money? Most books don't, but could it change one person's life by they have a better understanding of how a family goes through cancer treatment and so on? Having a major impact on one person can be quite motivating for some people. Some people don't like me saying that because they're like, well, no, you gotta be going for more. That's just an excuse to be aiming low. But certainly people's personal stories and then, just the human nature to try to help other people, a book can be part of that. But a book by itself doesn't promote itself, right? So that's where it's like, well, can you go from one, learning how to be an author, and if you're gonna do it, it's nice to learn how to do it well and not spend years and years what you could do in a matter of months
Right.
or a year and so on. But then it's this question of like, can you maybe grow as a person and grow your
Mm.
skills? And okay, how are you going to promote your book? That might not just be this scary thing that you don't want to deal with, this pain in the butt, but it could be another opportunity for growth. Are you going to learn how to do podcast interviews? Are you going to learn how to speak? Are you going to learn how to connect with other people through events and workshops? So it can be the beginning of another journey.
Yeah. Mm. So talk about that first journey, that first step, those first few months of hanging your own shingle. You said you already had some clients, you're already kind of doing this work, but what was it like? Did you have, even though you already had all these skills, did you feel like an imposter? Did you feel like, no, this company is going to work because I have the motivation, I have the passion, I have the skill set? And I'll stop there because I have like 5 other questions to follow up on that. So
Yes, and I'm a huge supporter of entrepreneurs or people who try to be entrepreneurs. And of course, authors, it's often an entrepreneurial project. So it was scary. It's honestly a blur and it gets busy really fast. Like I said, I started myself, I was bootstrapping, and then very quickly I was trying to hire part-time people and so later that year, we did get an office, hiring the first half-time employee and then hiring the first few full-time employees was a big commitment. One of the skills I had learned was to do sales and ask for payment up front to sort of
Mm,
get cash flow working in your
mhm.
favor. That can lead to trouble down the line if you don't use that money prudently. So we scaled up. We scaled up to about 12 people within a year or so. And to me, I've spoken to many entrepreneurs who don't want to hire other people, and I get why. People often say, the great thing about business is like the idea of the business, then you have customers and employees. And if you could just get rid of the customers and employees and investors, if you go that route, and I didn't go the route of investors, if I was doing it again, maybe I would see it differently, especially if you ever get into financial trouble and you realize you can lose your business to debtors just as much. But to me, there's a unique, so you have to make a decision that you're willing to try to build a team,
Mhm.
and many people don't, and that's great for them. And that's a personal choice, right? I would say kudos to the people who are willing to try to build a team, right? You're creating jobs, you're creating opportunities for other people, you're sharing your skills, you're training people. To me, there's a very unique stage, which is from one person to 12 people. And to me, that whole stage went pretty well. It was sort of hectic. It was crazy. It was very exciting, though. You're adding people to the team, and when you're adding people and adding clients, there's a sense of momentum and progress and excitement. And that, I would call that the honeymoon startup period. It went pretty well for us. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of sort of like you're trying to get your plane, fly your plane, and you're on the runway, but you're sort of putting on the wings as you go. And but going from 12 people up to sort of 20, 30 people, that to me is the most difficult period because at that point you have to try to build a management team, but when can you afford to do that? Really, you have to, from those first 12 people, you're trying to start to build managers. So it can be very, very difficult cash flow wise as well. So, but very exciting to put up the sign, set up an office, and put yourself out there.
Yeah. Well, and was your team primarily, or is it primarily in person? Is it a little bit of a hybrid?
At that time, it was. In the early stages, it was. Yeah. Yeah. But managing cash flow, that's tricky. And setting up software. For me, we were trying to build a bit of software to keep our system strong, but we couldn't really afford that until you get to about 12 people, and then you can fit in one, infrastructure person. But the thing is, it's also communication, right? 12 people is like a volleyball team. It's like many sports team. To communicate, you all get together in a room and you do a huddle. Boom. It's easy to communicate, right? Plus you have the energy, you're all there together. As you start to get around 20 to 30 people, then you start having groups and teams, and you really need to build that functional management team. And that's just really hard, especially if you're bootstrapping, to go from the little startup team where everyone's pretty new and to then trying to learn how to manage and lead a team and do things like HR. I don't like the term HR because it connotates to me things like rules and so on, but I think I made some mistakes there because we had almost no turnover in that 0 to 12 people in the first couple of years. And then there's just a certain moment where you're growing and then you have turnover and then you have to hire, and you have to hire quickly because you've got clients to serve, and then you hire too quickly and you don't necessarily hire the right people, or you don't onboard them well, or you don't support them well. I have to own the mistakes that we made. So, and then if you don't hire the right people, then you start having client issues, and that creates more work. And the more work means there's less time to manage well, and then you start having customer issues, and there can be sort of a downward spiral where if you make a wrong decision, then it results in upset customers, which results in lower morale, which results in more turnover, which results in more scrambling, and then maybe more bad decisions. And there's definitely a period kind of in the like 2 to 3 years into the business where we're still trying to grow, where all those there's sort of the risk of the flywheel operating in a negative flywheel where you just burst into flames and collapse, and I've seen it happen in our industry. But when you're starting a business, it's kind of like a crisis situation in from the get-go. But again, you've got things working for you, which is customers can really like working with a small company where everybody knows each other's name, you're working directly with the founder and so on. So yeah, so there's definitely some crisis moments in the first few years.
Everything that you're saying, I'm just thinking about when I accidentally started a PR firm during the pandemic because I kept getting client referrals. It's like I have to build a team now. And it happened so fast and organically. I didn't have all the systems, all the processes in place. The team worked really well. We got really great results for our clients. But I did make some decisions that were hiring more on vibe than, and perceived skill set versus on what people actually did bring to the table. I love that you said you get clients to pay some upfront because that's another thing. If you have a client who's like, "Oh, I'm going to get this grant money in," and then something happens, they don't get it or they don't pay you with it. So I've made all of those mistakes myself. Just being upfront and realize the systems and the processes are such an important part of setting that strong foundation so that people feel like they have ownership. Feel like They have the go ahead that they know their role in the organization. They know where they can grow. They know what they need to go to you or to other leaders for.
Yeah. And it's tough though for founders because how much do they know and how much experience do they have? I think that speaks to getting some support, some coaching, some advice, which is something we were fortunate to have. We joined a local accelerator. We had we've had various coaches along the way, and I think it's something that applies to all areas of life. If you have the right advisor at the right point in time, it can accelerate you
100%.
and save you a little bit, or just yeah, allow you to get through things a little better. And that was for us even in when we had our first child born in the NICU, as you mentioned in the beginning. In that environment, we had support. We had a team, medical support, and I find there's a lot of common denominators between trying to start a family, trying to start a business, and trying to start a book. A book, a business, and a family, all three of them have a lot in common. They're all sort of start premature. You've got to take steps before you're ready. You've got to learn as you go. You are going to be a little embarrassed. The first version is never going to be the best version. And then having the right team in place to support you, to complement your strengths, and ideally having some form of advisor or coach with a proven process and a playbook to guide you through quicker than you could do just figuring it out.
Yeah. Well, and you could have chosen to only publish other people. You could have just chosen to publish things that you wanted to write because you are also an author and you've chosen to do both. And if I'm looking at your website on my other screen, you have a lot of services, you have a lot of packages, but I think it's interesting that you've narrowed focus to children's publishing, regular and premium nonfiction. What distinguishes like regular publishing from premium nonfiction?
It's actually really interesting, even children's books and business books. So we do work across genres. The four big ones are like nonfiction, entrepreneurial, or self-help. Then there's fiction. Then you've got children's books, and you have memoir. Those are kind of the four groupings. But it's funny, even a children's book and business books, you would think they would be opposites. But really, almost anything you can do a business book on or a nonfiction book on, you can do a children's version of it. So it's like I could do a business book on how to write and publish a book, but then it's like, well, you could do a children's version of that as well. And the advantage of a children's one is you read it over and over again. So you can have your
True.
core message. So yeah, it's interesting. We're at a point where we have a large enough team that people have different passions, but the themes that I mentioned about what motivates people to publish, the service, and in fiction it's more of like entertainment value as opposed to advocating for a cause or helping somebody through a transformation. But those cross children's books and nonfiction and the steps involved in publishing a book. I wrote a book called The Call to Authorship, and I did focus more on nonfiction books, but a lot of the steps are the same across genres. So you could simplify it. You got to plan, write, publish, promote. I break it into 10 steps further where you edit, design, distribute, and so on. Those steps are the same for different genres. They just are different in some of the nuance. Like some editors will specialize in young adult versus nonfiction, and some of the marketing methods may be different, but there is a lot of overlap across the different genres.
Okay, fantastic. And if anybody's watching this, the call to authorship, the lovely orange and blue is right behind Tim's shoulder. So, talk to us about the process of deciding to write that book.
Well, a little bit of practice what you preach, and you would think we had published thousands of books at that point, including some big names like Lamar Jackson, the most valuable player in the NFL. His story is incredible. I mean, he lost his he was daddy's boy playing football in the backyard and lost his father to a car accident. And his mother stepped in and reignited his passion for football. And fast forward, if you're a football fan, she ended up working as his when he negotiated his big deal for 260 million over 5 years. His mom was his manager, not an agent.
It's amazing.
So definitely a super mom who stepped in and was supportive. But for me, it was also a little bit of practicing what you preach, but there's also still some gaps in my own knowledge because on the one hand, I'm supposed to be an expert. On the other hand, I'm busy. You're busy building a business,
Right.
right? So the things I should know. So, but it really allows you to, when you do a nonfiction, you can simplify it. People's strategic goals are often to build authority, to create visibility,
Mhm.
and to promote a business, to like generate leads and so on. Those are very common. Often to get into speaking, it gives you credibility. But when it gives you credibility, it's not just like a business card or a fake credibility. Actually, the process of writing the book, it actually makes you credible because you're outlining it in detail. Even myself, like I had knowledge gaps here and there, and when you're outlining your book, some of it you might be like, oh, I know this stuff. I'm going to write my book. I know, let's do it, the 7 principles of this or the 8 steps to that. And it might be easy to write if you've been doing it for years and you can fill in that knowledge, but you may find gaps in your knowledge as well. And I certainly did. There were some areas where I was weaker. So for me to go through the process of writing a book, it ended up taking almost 2 years to get it done. And it's hard, right, to do it. I did it, off the side of my desk, really. I didn't tell the team. I was kind of secretly doing it at first, but it's one of the big barriers people think is they don't have time to write a book. One of the biggest reasons they don't is like, oh, I'll do it in the future when I have much more time. But for me, it was I just needed about 30 minutes a day. And my habit was before I have my first sip of my second cup of coffee, I'm going to write at least my first word on the manuscript. And when you do that, you can actually get it done. But the key is you're not trying to write the whole book, you're just trying to write small little pieces and have a habit that you can stick to. And when you do that, it's like 500 words a day becomes 50,000 in 100 days. Just with if you can find that 30 minutes, which is not easy in everybody's life. If you have kids, if you have a business, if you have a job, can be a whole process trying to get that habit in place. So, but it can get quite rewarding once you get momentum. You're tracking your word count and you're making progress. So I found it a super enjoyable process, and I've learned a lot doing it.
I think that's a really good tip for anybody who's listening who aspires to who is called to authorship but doesn't know when they're gonna find the time. And I particularly like that you said before you have your first sip of your second cup of coffee. So it really shows that and
Exactly.
illustrates where you're putting that in. I do wanna go back a little bit because a lot of times when we're faced with something big in our lives, that's the inflection point when we leave our jobs, right? But you had this point of your crisis in the NICU with your child in the early years of your publishing company. So that's a personal, test. It's something you have to deal with emotionally, physically, mentally, but it's also a leadership test. So how did you figure out how to run this company, continue to keep it up and running and expanding while also dealing with something very personal that would derail a lot of people?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it was a challenge. So our child was born at 24 weeks and 5 days, and we were telling ourselves it wasn't going to happen. Long day at the hospital, it happened. And then you've got this, he was less than 2 pounds, maybe a pound and a half, and it's just one thing after the next in terms of like everything they do to help the baby carries with it its own risk, and you just have to go with it. You have to accept what you can control and what you can't control, and we went through that pretty well, I think. Although 128 days later, when we left the hospital, it's the first day not having like all the heartbeat and the oxygen levels, and we felt like imposters there. We're like, we're allowed to just take the baby and out of there. And now he's 9 years old. His amazing kid. He was just did track and field. He did his first track and field event last week. He came in last place, but he was super happy and had a good experience. So yeah, to do business at that was tough because it was right at that growth, that stage of going from the sort of 10 people to 30 people, which it sucks cash out of the business.
Right.
You have to take risk. Every person you add to the team, you kind of have to they have to add value right away. So, and then we got married that year as well. We had, a month after getting out of the hospital, we had a wedding date,
Gosh.
which is
Yeah.
wonderful, right? But it's
Yes.
also a lot of work.
Yeah.
Thank you to
Ambitious.
Monica doing most of the planning work. So that was amazing. And then it was later that year that I sort of saw it's like, oh, once we pair GST, which is the value added tax in Canada, I'm like, once we pay that, and at that point we just had to pay it, I think once a year, and then it becomes quarterly I was like, we're gonna be tight on cash. So it came down to just, well, yeah, to not burn out. That's the question. How do you not burn out? And maybe your business fails, and people have businesses fail and move on and start another one. It can be, but it's tough when you've built a team and you have a bunch of clients because if this business fails, it's going to hurt not just yourself, it's going to hurt a bunch of customers, it's going to hurt a lot of employees and so on. So yeah, you feel the pressure. That's why kudos to entrepreneurs. That's why, I just am so supportive of entrepreneurs when they take those steps. But I'm just going to say the obvious things, like it's like competing in sports. You need to be healthy.
Mhm.
So sleep, diet, and exercise.
Mm.
And I found one of the most painful experiences when I had to let somebody go who was really core to the business, but it was just clear that it had come to a point where it was no longer the right fit. It was time to separate, but it was going to be a really, really painful process. And I knew I wasn't going to sleep. And it was going to be a longer process in this situation. It was going to take, a month or two. And so when you're gearing up for a stressful phase of business, which I mean, many phases of business but especially when it involves people, I think that
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
depends on your
Absolutely.
personality and your makeup. But if something's going to involve conflict with other people and they're not going to be happy, like, oh, that's going to be draining, right? Even if you're being as healthy as you can be, it's going to be weighing on you and it's going to be hard to sleep. But you kind of accept that. It's like somebody who's going to go into a fight or a boxing match. I personally drew inspiration from, Olympians, fighters in Canada, we have George St. Pierre. He's a martial artist but a very principled martial artist, a good, he got the athlete of the year in Canada, a very respected person. But he talks about getting ready for a fight. Like in that business, it's not a fun day at the job,
Right.
is it? So he talks about, positive self-talk and something, but still leading up to something it's really stressful, it's going to be painful. So I think trying to be healthy, eat, sleep, exercise, being physically healthy, and that will help you get through a period where you're going to be losing sleep. You're going to be, and then it's how you frame things, right? How do you
Right.
frame what you're doing? And are you tying it to a purpose, right?
Mm.
Often as an entrepreneur, it's supposed to be your job to make everybody feel like the work you're doing is purposeful. And ultimately, you have to convince yourself that what you're doing is purposeful, right? That can be a dilemma people go through. It's like, is this worth it? Is this the right? That's this idea, again, for authors as well as for entrepreneurs. It's like, what's your calling? What is going to be worth suffering for is kind of the question, right? Because when it means something to you, that helps you get through it, right? That helps you be stronger. It helps you get through the tough times. So trying to decide what you just want to do, the kind of want that's like dopamine, maybe just a shallower want versus a deeper form of want where you can go through the slog. I think that's something we have to just try to discern in our lives, the difference between the two, and try to find that calling that helps us get through the tough times.
Yeah. I think that's really important, staying focused on what's really important. And I'm sure you had to do that when you're managing the business, you're living in the NICU, you're trying to figure out, do you have the right people? I'm sure at that point you weren't getting enough sleep, you weren't eating enough, you weren't doing the things that you're telling us right now are important to maintain your sanity and your health when you're going through difficult times and difficult decision-making processes.
Even if you do them, it's still going to be tough. You're not going to sleep as well, but you'll sleep a little better than you otherwise would, right? You'll be a little bit more resilient.
You're based in Victoria, which is on Vancouver Island, which is a really, really beautiful place to visit. I'm sure it's a very beautiful place to live as well, but it's not something we think about as like a bastion of publishing, right? You were talking about the New York publishing houses earlier, and you have published over 6,000 books, which is I don't know many smaller or independent publishing houses that have had that quality and quantity, and your authors are all over the place. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? What's your secret sauce that helped you grow? What is it about the systems and the team that you built who can handle that many authors at a time? Because certainly you can't touch every single one of those authors and those books yourself at all times.
Yeah. Well, there is a bit of backstory in Victoria specifically, where in the early stages of self-publishing, there were three companies in the US, one in, I think, Pennsylvania, one in California, one in maybe Tennessee. I might get that wrong. And then there was one in Canada in Victoria. And there were the sort of three American companies and one Canadian company. They ended up, it ended up going all over the place. But so we do have that bit of local history where then there was another entrepreneur that used to be involved in that first business. He started a second business and I worked at that, but that was one part of my career path, right? I worked in that while it was still in its sort of 2 to 3, 4 years into business. And so I'm sort of third generation evolution. So there's a bit of that. Publishing newspapers, publishing magazines, publishing books, they do have certain things in common, right? Editing, design, distribution, printing, marketing. But yeah, to really hone it, to know your customer, to make it something that can scale. The piece that I mentioned that where a business needs a coach and someone starting a family, especially starting a family in the hospital, you need a coach. This is something I've been very passionate about, which is the guide function. So it's like the coach function. If you're going to start a business, if you could just have that one person who just can guide you along. And so on the one hand, yeah, to do a book, you need to edit it, design, distribution, market it. When you add it all together, though, I try to make it sound simple, but there's a lot of different pieces. The missing piece and the piece that we've tried to do in a special way is what I call the guide, that guide function. And it's not just like a person's role. It's like the piece that just ties it all together and holds someone's hand. It's a mix of advice and support, encouragement, quality control, and project management. I just said five things. They're all five very different things, but how do you do that? And you have to meet people's expectations. So it's like our philosophy is when we meet with somebody, we talk to them, we get excited about their goals, we talk to them about what we can do. One of the most important things we do is rigorous client feedback, and we do that at the end of the process as well as at various points throughout the process. But our goal is that when we finish, that people look back at everything we said we would do and they say, well, you guys did exactly what you said you would do and you follow through on it. So that's one of the key ways we measure success. But again, it comes down to that guide role. Like, how do you do, especially for adults, like it's like adult education, different personalities, different stuff. And we can't tell them everything we know at the beginning because that's fire hosing, too much information. They won't get it. We need to tell them just the right amount of information and we need to empower them and guide and support. Sometimes it's just that someone having trouble logging into an account or like using a word processing tool, or it can be getting help with the silliest thing, or it can just be that little extra check-in, like, how's it going? We're here, we're rooting for you. That bit of encouragement, right? That encouragement to take the next step and to know what that next step is. So for us, it was just really taking that guide role, the piece that ties it all together and supports the author in a special way and treating that as a special thing. Because there's people in the industry who will say, well, you did, just do it all yourself. And doing it all yourself can work for some people. I'm not opposed to the traditional publishing model. I think it's great when it works. You can go more do it yourself. You can also do it where you manage every piece as an author. So that's where the author is basically wearing the project manager hat for their book. And that can work well for the right person who wants to do that, who has the skills to do it, and who wants to kind of learn as they go. So I'm not opposed. That model I think is great for that particular person. But then there's other people who just they want that support and guidance, and then they want the benefits of self-publishing. So that's what we try to do
Yeah.
well for people.
Yeah, you try to thread that needle. That's amazing. What do you think is easier for authors today? than it was when you started? Because as I mentioned at the beginning, the industry has certainly changed a lot.
What's easier today? Hmm. It's interesting because on the one hand, with when it comes to promoting a book, there is less opportunity in some ways. There's less opportunity in the big media, but there's more opportunity in the small media. So what I mean, there's less opportunity in terms of like there used to be book sections of newspapers but nowadays in the fragmented media space, there's so much opportunity. I think what's getting more better is people are realizing what can and cannot be done with a book. So if your goal is just to sell a bunch of books, that's actually super hard to do. It's hard to do when you're competing against a couple million other books, plus the streaming platforms, all the other entertainment that's out there. But when you understand what you can do with a book, which is you can get more visible, you can use it as a marketing tool, you can use it to get credibility, to tie into things like media, to speaking, to promoting a consulting business and so on, then you can focus on that and actually set more achievable versions of goals. So people are often like, I'm gonna like get on Oprah, I'm gonna become famous, or I'm gonna make a ton of money on royalties. And it's like, no. I mean, maybe, maybe, but there's a more realistic version of most of those goals, which is like, I'm gonna get on Oprah. No, but if with a little guidance, if in your space, the podcast space, if you learn how to do it, you can certainly become more visible in your niche, and that can be very valuable. It's hard to make a lot of money just on royalties. You can certainly try, but you can tie a book to speaking, to workshops, to services, and so on, and that's where it can actually help quite a bit, especially when tied to the visibility and so on. So I think nowadays having more clarity about what you can and can't do with a bowl and with a book and using it strategically has made things better. Beyond that, though, just distribution. So, like I said, the whole print on demand, ebooks, audiobooks, that's way better than it was at least a couple decades ago.
Yeah. I feel like we're just skimming the surface because I've been able to ask you a lot of questions about different areas, but there's so much more depth that we could get into. And certainly we'll have to have you back on to have another conversation if you're willing. But I'd love to hear, what advice would you give yourself if you go back in time to when you decided to launch your own business, this business specifically? Is there any advice, anything that you do differently?
I don't have any regrets. I don't have any regrets. I mentioned I don't like HR. I don't like rules. I We learned how to be better managers. We've done like every different personality exercise. The importance of cohesion, that's the piece. So when it goes to like building a functioning management team, I had no idea how to do that. And I did it wrong before I did it better. And what I didn't understand, and it relates to HR though, is cohesion. When people are just joining your organization, they're so receptive, right? They're receptive to any messages you
Yeah,
give,
the
right? You just
newness, the excitement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're like sponges. They're willing to so as long as you set expectations well during the hiring process and during the onboarding process, then you can kind of orient people to not mislead them. But the cohesion piece was something I didn't get. Like in business, you've got the hard parts of the business, the numbers, the cash flow. It's got to make strategic sense. It's got to make business sense. And they have the soft side of the business, the human stuff, the purpose, the culture, and the cohesion. So the cohesion I just didn't get. I didn't get that it's not like something you do at an annual retreat once a year where you fall backwards and you have to catch the person and build trust. It should be every day, every those just small little interactions. They get to know each other. Trying to get to know each other, build trust, know your weaknesses, know each other's weaknesses. That's hard to do. And if you have 10 people on a team and then you go to 11 people, like adding that one person, you have to start from square one and get to know each other. And it's an enjoyable process, but it takes time and it's something you have to just like constantly do. And we're trying to do it in a remote work environment too. You can still do it, but it just means constantly doing little activities. Like we start almost every meeting with just like either a good news, something personal or whatever, but those activities to get to know each other, to start to drop your guard. I didn't get how important that is, but if you don't have a certain level of cohesion and knowing each other at a personal level, then you may not communicate very well and you may not make good decisions as a business.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Obviously, I said, we have a lot more we could discuss and get into, but for now, we'll just leave this teaser for the audience. And your tellwellpublishing.com and Tellwell Publishing, I think on all the socials, and then of course your book called authorship.com. And you do have a free guide as well.
Yeah, we have a guide to self-publishing. It kind of walks you through some of the big questions people have, like the difference between traditional and self-publishing. What are the steps that you take to publish and so on. So we have that free guide. It's a great way to start.
Yeah. So it's a free guide to start, but I think it's particularly helpful that you position your company as guides to help people because I know a lot of us have ideas for books inside of us for whatever the reasons are, and we don't end up doing it. We don't end up finding that time in between, the first and second cups of coffee to start the process. We don't know where to start. We don't know what we don't know. As you said when you wrote the call to authorship, there are some things that you still didn't know and you had to learn. And I think that's really important also is to be a founder who's always seeking to learn more, right? Seeking to get better at our crafts and to figure out how can we continue innovating and helping people bring their messages forward. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, Tim, of course, my last question, do you have a favorite quote, mantra, verse, poem, family motto, or in your case, even a favorite book that you think everybody should read?
Well, for developing a habit, I recommend Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's not like he hasn't sold enough copies of that, but it's
Yeah.
for a reason. It's for a reason. Poet William Blake, I was inspired by him as a teenager. To desire, he who desires but acts not breeds pestilence is a quote. It's kind of a intense one, but the idea is like, and this isn't like, it's the difference between a calling and a more shallow desire. You have to look at it that way. But if you have something inside you that it keeps coming to you and you feel called to do it and you keep ignoring it and ignoring it, if it's something that you discern to be important in your life and you keep ignoring it, that's not healthy. So I think it's trying to listen for that emotional side, something that's calling to you and listening to it and discerning if it's important and if it is to take action on that while ignoring the base desires that we also have that are being addicted to our phones and so on. So discerning between those two. But William Blake, quite a character. That's a quote I'll leave you with.
Amazing. Yeah. It's pretty intense, but also something we need to hear and something that's true. So love that ending. And to everybody who's listening, I know I have 5 books inside me at least of all different genres that because I wanted to be an author when I was younger. And of course, we go on these other journeys. But think about what you would write and who you could impact with your message and how it could help you beyond the accolades of money from book sales or being, that number 1 bestseller on Amazon or whatever the case may be. And just sketch that out for yourself. See what you come up with. And you know who to reach out to if you decide to move forward. So thank you again for joining me on Your Brand Amplified, Tim Lindsay, and to the audience. I'll be back again with another amazing guest to share their story and their journey very soon. Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbrandamplified.com.